I'm going to call this part 1 of the like a tuning guide for the Tamiya Avante 2011 series. So first I'll show you some of the things I've done since the last build video for this chassis. Probably what stands out the most are the front and rear suspensions. Okay, so for the rear shocks, I have associated 1.02 inch gold body shock. These are vintage shocks. In order to mount the shock cap onto the tower, I had to put 4 washers here between the shock bushing and the shock tower. Do that on either side. Put a lock nut on this side and a long screw on this side, and then you're set. On the bottom, you got to be a little trickier. Let me show you. Well, maybe you don't have to be trickier. You just got to be careful. So this bottom piece here that this spring mounts onto, this is actually an HPI piece. The piece that this shock came with was a little shallow, and if it's shallow, then when suspension compresses, it's going to rub up against this mounting point on the trailing arm, and then you're going to get binding in the suspension. So just make sure you have a piece here that has sort of a long leg, for lack of a better term, so that it doesn't bind up against this trailing arm. Okay, so that's how you can make the rear suspension run a little smoother, because the stock shocks have a smaller shock body, and they don't provide quite as good of damping performance. Now, I would say that these shocks are maybe a little too long for the rear. I might try something like a smaller shock body, so I can get a little more travel, although this will probably bottom out as it is. I do have down travel limiters in here, but that's how I made that work. And then on the front, if you go watch the part 1 of my Tamiya egress rebuild video, I had made mention of the person who sold it to me had made 2 aluminum shock towers, and I just took one of them and mounted them here. You can go to pargoostore.com, and they do make alloy shock towers, front and rear, for the Avante 2001, and also for the Tamiya egress. They're a little different, but they would each work. Maybe the exact mounting point might be a little different geometrically, but you can do that to try to kick up the front shock angle and make the suspension a little bit softer. These are also 1.02 inch associated shocks. I have what are effectively B44 front springs in here, so the springs are smaller than the shock, so I just had to put a shock collar in here to hold this in place. Otherwise, nothing too special, I guess. Oh, right. So the screw that you would mount in here, I put not a lock nut, but just like a standard Tamiya nut in there to act as a spacer for the ball end here on the bottom of the shock, so that this fits nice and smooth and it doesn't bind against anything. For the front here against the shock bushing, I have 2 washers between the shock cap and the shock tower. You just barely get clearance here between the shock cap and the shock tower. Okay, so that's what I did for the suspension. For the turnbuckles, I didn't get rid of them, but I just took them off. The stock aluminum metal ball ends and the screw in the middle. It's a real pain to try to adjust camber and everything. So the easier thing to do is just replace them with turnbuckles. So these blue turnbuckles, these are titanium turnbuckles from Associated. It's a set that you can get for the TC3 chassis, and that set is only like $20 to $25. Very inexpensive for titanium turnbuckles. They fit perfectly to this chassis. So I'd recommend that if you want a set of good turnbuckles for this. And I mount those against 6mm adjusters. Tamiya calls these adjusters rather than ball cups, but you can look those up, and they sell a set of like 12 or something black adjusters that you can buy. And then these red bits here are these aluminum ball nuts. So these are threaded on the inside, and it's round on one end and sort of flat on the other. So the round end I mount down at the bottom, and the flat end there I keep it at the top, because the screw that you would use to screw it in, this screw head would otherwise bind up against this ball cup as the suspension compresses. So if you flip it over and mount that sort of flat piece on top, then that solves that problem. And in the back here, I just have, you know, a 6mm ball stud here that goes into this mounting point, and that's how I can fit this turnbuckle on. This one actually popped out during the main event. I was at the Vintage Off-Road Nationals just today. I just got back, and I made it to the main event, and this popped out, and I was out of the race. So you might want to get a ball stud with a longer screw in it just to keep that more secure, or maybe use thread lock or something. But if you use thread lock, then you can't put spacers in there to change the roll center. Okay, so that's another thing. I removed the front and rear anti-roll bars. The rear ones you have to remove because when you put the turnbuckles in, that little mounting piece that would hold in the anti-roll bar is not going to go on this, so you just have to take it out. On the front, the front was too stiff, so I took it out to give it a try and then see if that helped anything. I may put it back in, but you know, this thing still needs a lot of tuning. One of the problems that I noticed with this chassis was that it was very hard to keep it in a straight line on the track. So I was racing against other vintage chassis, some vintage Kyosho lasers, some vintage Schumacher Cat 2000s, I think, and one Yokomo YZ10. And they were all doing much better than I, not necessarily because they have more driving skill. I was just having a really hard time keeping this chassis between the lines. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that this comes with gear diffs stock. And once the grease wears in on those gear diffs, the diffs become very loose, okay? And when they're very loose like that, if you hit a little bump and it sets the car off a little bit, the car is just going to start darting off in different directions. It's very hard to keep in a straight line. This car does not like to slide at all. And I'm used to sliding my B44 when I go racing, so this requires a very different type of driving technique. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that this is a smaller wheelbase, and the track width is smaller, and the chassis tends to ride a little bit higher than B44 or even the other vintage chassis I was racing against. So this is going to take more work to make it race-worthy. I don't know if I'll ever get there to, you know, making this as competitive as some of these other chassis, but I'm going to give it a try. One of the things I'd like to do is to take these trailing arms and move them out a little bit. So this arm screws into this ball end, and also on this side there's a screw here. So you can unscrew both of those and push this out to make the front wider. For the rear, you can kind of do the same thing, right? You can unscrew this and this to push the rear out. And also back. So if you screw this out, it pushes the rear wheels back, and the trailing arm pivots on this point here, so it just pushes it back like this. And then of course the problem there is you're moving the wheel back, but you're also increasing or decreasing rear toe in. So then you have to unscrew this to add rear toe in, but it also, you know, increases the width. So with the rear trailing arm, you can't seem to adjust the width without also adjusting the wheelbase and the toe in. They're all kind of linked together. But I'll give this a try. I might screw this out a few millimeters and see if that helps a little bit. So it's going to take more work. And there's another vintage race coming up in about a month and a half. So we'll see how it goes by then. I am getting, I did order the torque splitter set so I can get ball diffs in the front and rear. I hope that'll help a lot because that seemed to be a big problem here. Let's see, what else do I want to mention here? So in terms of electronics, the electronics fared pretty well over the race weekend. I have a Tekin Redline 10.5 turn motor in here. I took out the 7.5 turn motor partly because it's not allowed in the vintage racing rules. You need a 10.5 or a 13.5. But also, this motor is really powerful. When I first ran this in this chassis, it loosened up the center diff, and I have to run it completely tightened, which doesn't really help because the center diff is supposed to act as both a center diff and a slipper clutch. And you can't really do that if you're running a really powerful motor. So the 10.5 works just fine. This Turnigy Trackstar 100 amp speed control, I haven't had any problems with it so far. It works great. It stays cool, no real problems there. I have a separate body that I ran on this. So I didn't want to beat up the original body that I painted and put the original decals on. I had made mention in one of the build videos, either for this or the Black Special, that there are little holes, vent holes that you can cut on the sides of the body to keep everything cool. I did not do that. I tried just running without those holes cut, and it runs fine. I mean, this motor doesn't get up to 160 degrees. It stays pretty cool. The electronics stay cool, so you don't have to make any extra holes in the body, which would also get more dirt in the chassis. So ignore that previous comment that I had made about cutting the body. You don't really need that for modern brushless systems. Okay, so that's it for now. I'm gonna, again, this is a project here, trying to make this competitive. I'm gonna do what I can to make it work better, and you know, when I feel more comfortable with it, I'll make another video. So that's it for now.